Have you ever stood in a room full of people who were supposed to be there to help you, only to realize they were all waiting for you to break? That was me, standing in that courtroom on a Tuesday morning that felt like the end of everything I'd ever known, wearing a dress I'd borrowed because he'd made sure I had nothing of my own left, feeling every single pair of eyes on me like needles piercing through whatever dignity I had managed to scrape together that morning. He was sitting there just 20 feet away from me, with that smile I'd once thought was charming but now recognized as the predator's grin it had always been, and I could see exactly what he expected to happen next. He expected me to crumble, to cry, to beg, to prove to everyone in that room that I was exactly the unstable, emotional, irrational woman he'd spent the last 3 years telling everyone I was. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, the public crushing he'd orchestrated so carefully, the final humiliation that would leave me with nothing, not even my own sense of reality. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known because his arrogance had made him blind, was that I had spent the last 6 months turning every weapon he'd ever used against me into ammunition for my own freedom. My hands were shaking as I stood there. I won't lie to you about that, because fear doesn't just disappear even when you've got the upper hand. But underneath that fear was something else. Something that had been growing inside me like a fire that refused to be extinguished no matter how many times he tried to drown it. It was rage, pure and focused, and it was determination forged in the darkness of too many nights spent wondering if I'd survive to see morning. I remember looking at him across that courtroom and thinking about how we'd gotten here, about all the tiny moments that had led to this one, about every time I'd convinced myself that things would get better, that he'd change, that love was supposed to feel like walking on broken glass just to reach someone who kept moving further away. The judge hadn't entered yet, and in that strange, suspended moment before everything began, I felt my entire past with him flash through my mind like a movie I'd been forced to watch 1,000 times, but was finally seeing clearly for the first time. It started 5 years ago at a charity fundraiser I'd almost skipped because I'd been exhausted from a long week at work, and I remember standing by the dessert table, trying to decide if I had enough social energy left to make small talk with anyone, when he appeared beside me with a joke about the chocolate fountain that actually made me laugh, really laugh, for the first time in months. His name was Marcus, and he had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the entire room, like everything you said was the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. And God, I was so hungry for that kind of attention after years of feeling invisible that I didn't stop to question why someone so charming and successful was so interested in someone like me, a mid-level marketing manager who spent most weekends reorganizing her apartment and reading books she'd already read before. He told me I was beautiful, but not in the way that felt hollow or rehearsed. He told me I was beautiful in a way that made it seem like he was surprised by his own realization, like he'd discovered something precious that no one else had noticed, and that made me feel special in a way I'd never felt before. We started dating within a week, and those first few months were like living inside a romance novel where everything was perfect, and nothing could possibly go wrong. He took me to restaurants I couldn't afford, surprised me with weekend trips to places I'd only dreamed of visiting, and introduced me to his friends who all seemed to think I was wonderful because that's what he told them I was. I remember my best friend Sarah expressing some concerns after she met him for the first time, saying something about how he seemed to dominate every conversation, and how she noticed he'd interrupted me several times without seeming to realize it. But I brushed it off because I thought she was just being overprotective, because I thought I'd finally found someone who saw my value when I'd spent so long feeling like I didn't have any. Looking back now, I can see that those first months weren't about love at all. They were about evaluation, about him studying me like a scientist studies a specimen, learning all my vulnerabilities and insecurities and weaknesses so he could use them later. And I was so blinded by the attention and affection that I handed him a detailed map of every way to hurt me without even realizing what I was doing. The changes started so gradually that I didn't notice them at first, like how you don't notice the temperature dropping 1 degree at a time until suddenly you realize you're freezing and you can't remember when you last felt warm. It began with little comments about my friends, casual observations that seemed harmless in the moment, but planted seeds of doubt that would grow into forests of isolation. He'd mentioned that Sarah seemed jealous of our relationship, that maybe she was a bad influence, that her own failed relationships proved she didn't understand what real love looked like. And because I trusted him, because I believed he only wanted what was best for me, I started seeing my oldest friend through his eyes, instead of my own. Then came the suggestions about my appearance, never quite criticisms but always framed as helpful advice, like how I might look more professional if I wore less makeup, or how that dress made me look like I was trying too hard, or how my laugh was a little too loud for certain situations, and maybe I should be more aware of how I came across to other people. Every time he said something like that, he'd follow it up with, "I'm only telling you this because I love you and I want you to be the best version of yourself." And I believed him because I'd been conditioned my entire life to think that people who loved you were supposed to help you improve. That accepting criticism was what mature adults did in healthy relationships. My job started becoming a problem too. At first, he was supportive, always asking about my day, and seeming interested in my projects. But slowly that interest transformed into concern, into suggestions that maybe I was working too hard, that maybe my boss was taking advantage of me, that maybe I should consider something less stressful because he could see how exhausted I was all the time. The truth was that I was exhausted, but not because of my job. I was exhausted because I'd started spending every spare moment trying to be perfect enough for him, analyzing every word I said and every move I made to make sure I wouldn't disappoint him or give him a reason to be upset with me. We moved in together after about 8 months, and he convinced me that it made sense to move into his place because it was bigger and nicer than my apartment, and I gave up my lease without realizing I was giving up my escape route, without understanding that having nowhere to go except the home he owned was exactly what he wanted. Have you ever felt like you're slowly disappearing? Like pieces of yourself are being erased one by one until you look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back at you? Comment below if you've ever experienced this, because I want you to know you're not alone. By the end of the first year, I'd stopped seeing most of my friends because somehow every time I made plans with them, something would come up. He'd planned a special dinner I couldn't miss, or he'd be having a hard day and really needed me there, or he'd point out that I'd been spending so much time with other people lately that he was starting to feel neglected, and the guilt would crush me until I canceled my plans and stayed home with him instead. My relationship with my family became strained because he'd orchestrated situations where I had to choose between him and them, like scheduling trips during family holidays and getting upset if I suggested we should visit my parents instead, or getting into arguments right before family events so that I'd show up distracted and emotional and unable to fully engage with the people I loved. My mother noticed something was wrong. I could see it in her eyes every time we talked on the phone, in the way her voice would get careful and measured like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing and pushing me further away. But I'd gotten so good at defending him and making excuses for his behavior that I'd shut down every attempt she made to express concern. At work, my performance started slipping because I was always distracted, always worried about what mood he'd be in when I got home, always checking my phone to respond to his messages immediately, because if I didn't, the consequences would be hours of him explaining how hurt he was that I didn't prioritize our relationship, how other women would kill to have someone who cared about them as much as he cared about me. The thing about control is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up at your door wearing a sign that says, "I'm here to destroy your autonomy and sense of self." It creeps in wearing the mask of love and concern and protection. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already so tangled up in it that you can't remember what freedom felt like. He'd started controlling our finances too, suggesting that it would be easier if we had a joint account that he managed since he was better with money than I was. And I'd agreed because I was tired of fighting about every purchase I made, tired of having to justify why I needed new shoes or wanted to buy a birthday present for a friend, tired of the spreadsheets he'd create showing me how my frivolous spending was affecting our future together. My paycheck went into that joint account, and he gave me an allowance for personal expenses. And I actually thanked him for helping me be more financially responsible because I'd internalized his narrative so completely that I couldn't see I was being stripped of my economic independence piece by piece. The breaking point came on a night that started like any other night in our suffocating routine, with me walking on eggshells from the moment I got home from work, trying to gauge his mood by the way he greeted me at the door. And on this particular night, I could tell immediately that something was wrong, because he barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. I'd stopped at the grocery store on the way home to pick up ingredients for his favorite dinner, thinking maybe I could smooth over whatever was bothering him with a good meal and a quiet evening. But when I started unpacking the bags, he appeared in the kitchen doorway with this expression on his face that I'd learned to dread, that cold calculation that meant he'd been building up to something all day and was ready to unleash it. He asked me why I'd spent $47 at the grocery store when we'd just gone shopping 3 days ago, and I explained about the dinner I was planning to make. But he cut me off and asked me why I thought it was okay to waste our money without consulting him first, why I was always so impulsive and thoughtless about our financial goals, why I couldn't learn to be more responsible like he'd been trying to teach me for the past 2 years. I felt something crack inside me in that moment, something that had been bending and bending under the weight of his constant criticism and control, but had somehow managed to stay intact until now, and it just shattered. And before I could stop myself, I said that it was my money too, that I'd earned it and I had a right to spend it on groceries without needing his permission, like I was a child asking for allowance. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring, that makes time feel like it's stopped. And then he smiled, which was somehow worse than if he'd started yelling. And he said in this perfectly calm voice that if I wanted to be treated like an adult, maybe I should start acting like one, that maybe I should move out and see how well I did managing my own finances without his support, that he was tired of carrying dead weight in this relationship and maybe we both needed to reconsider whether this was working. The terror that flooded through me in that moment was visceral and overwhelming because I suddenly realized that I had nothing. No savings because it all went into the joint account he controlled. No apartment to go back to because I'd given it up to move in with him. No friends I could call because I'd isolated myself so thoroughly that I'd probably burned most of those bridges. And even my relationship with my family was strained enough that showing up on their doorstep would require explanations I wasn't ready to give. I ended up apologizing, of course, crying and begging him not to leave me, promising I'd do better and be more considerate and stop being so selfish. And he let me grovel for what felt like hours before finally agreeing to give me another chance, before pulling me into a hug and telling me he loved me, and he only got upset because he cared so much about our future together. But something had shifted in me during those moments of pure terror. Some small part of my brain had woken up and started asking questions I'd been too afraid to ask before. Like, why did love have to feel like this? Like drowning slowly while someone held your hand and promised they were saving you? I started paying attention after that night, really paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to do before, because seeing the truth would have meant admitting how bad things had gotten, and what I saw terrified me. I noticed how he'd systematically cut me off from every support system I'd ever had, how he'd positioned himself as the only person I could trust, the only person who truly understood me, the only person who would put up with all my flaws and inadequacies. I noticed how every conversation somehow became about him, how my feelings were always dismissed or minimized while his feelings were treated as emergencies that required immediate attention and action. I noticed how he'd created this narrative about me being unstable, emotional, and irrational, how he'd tell stories to his friends about my episodes and my overreactions, stories that were either completely fabricated or wildly distorted versions of real events where he'd pushed me to the breaking point and then documented my breakdown as evidence of my instability. I started keeping a journal hidden in my car, writing down everything that happened each day, every conversation, every incident, because I was starting to doubt my own memory, and I needed something concrete to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, that his version of reality wasn't the only version. I found online forums about emotional abuse and narcissistic relationships, reading them late at night on my phone in the bathroom with the door locked, and with every post I read, I saw my own life reflected back at me in ways that were both validating and absolutely devastating. These strangers on the internet were describing my relationship with such accuracy that I sometimes had to put my phone down and cry quietly into a towel so he wouldn't hear me and ask what was wrong, because I was finally understanding that what I'd thought was love was actually a carefully constructed prison, and the man I'd thought was my partner was actually my jailer. And I'd been so completely gaslit that I'd been thanking him for every bar he'd added to my cage. The moment I decided to actually do something about it, to not just recognize the problem, but to actively fight back, came about 3 months after that grocery store incident, when I overheard him on the phone in his office talking to someone about me, in a way that made my blood run cold. I'd come home early from work because I'd been feeling sick, and I heard his voice coming from behind his closed office door. And normally, I would have just gone to the bedroom to rest because interrupting him when he was working was against the rules he'd established. But something in his tone made me stop and listen. He was laughing, this casual, friendly laugh, and he was saying things like, "Yeah, she's completely dependent on me now, has no idea what's in the accounts. I could tell her we're broke tomorrow and she'd believe it. And the best part is she thinks it's all her fault. Thinks she's lucky I put up with her. And honestly, at this point, I'm just waiting for the right moment to trade up. You know, someone younger and less damaged." I stood there in the hallway listening to him discuss me like I was a car he was planning to sell. Like the past 3 years of my life had been nothing but a game to him. Entertainment, a power trip, and the person on the other end of the phone was laughing too, egging him on. And I realized this wasn't just about control or even about cruelty. This was about him getting off on systematically destroying another human being and then bragging about it to his friends. I went to the bedroom and lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than fear or guilt or shame. I felt rage, pure and clarifying rage that burned through all the fog of manipulation and gaslighting and made me see everything with perfect clarity. He wanted me crushed, wanted me broken, wanted to be able to tell the story of how he'd tried to help this damaged woman, but she'd been too far gone to save. And then he wanted to walk away and do the same thing to someone else while I was left with nothing, not even my own sense of reality. But here's the thing about rage when it's righteous, when it's earned through years of systematic abuse. It can be fuel, it can be power, it can be the thing that finally gives you the strength to save yourself when you thought you were too weak to even try. Do you know what it feels like to suddenly see clearly after years of confusion? Tell me in the comments about a moment when you realized you had to change everything. I started planning my escape that night, lying in bed next to him, pretending to be asleep while my mind raced through possibilities and strategies and potential obstacles. And the first thing I realized was that I needed evidence, documentation, proof that would stand up in court because I knew he wasn't going to let me go quietly. Knew he'd use every resource and connection and manipulation tactic he had to maintain control over me even after I left. I started being more strategic about the journal I was keeping, making sure to include dates and times and exact quotes, taking photos of things he'd damaged during his rages that he'd later deny or claim I'd damaged myself, screenshotting messages and emails that showed his patterns of control and manipulation. I opened a secret bank account at a different bank using an address I got from a mail forwarding service, and I started siphoning tiny amounts of money from the joint account he controlled. Never enough that he'd notice, but enough that over time it would add up to something I could use to survive when I left. I reached out to Sarah, my old best friend who I'd abandoned on his orders, and I sent her a message that just said, "I need help and I'm sorry for everything." And she called me within 5 minutes, crying, telling me she'd been waiting for this call for 3 years, and she was here for whatever I needed. Having her back in my corner, even in secret, even just through brief phone calls I had to make from parking lots during my lunch break, gave me strength I didn't know I still had access to, reminded me that I'd had a life before him and could have a life after him. I connected with a domestic violence organization that specialized in helping women escape emotionally abusive relationships, and the counselor I spoke with helped me understand that what I was experiencing was real abuse, even though he'd never hit me, even though from the outside our relationship might look functional or even enviable, and she helped me create a safety plan for when I was ready to leave. The hardest part was continuing to live with him while I was planning my escape, maintaining the facade of the compliant, broken woman he expected me to be, while simultaneously building the foundation for my freedom. And there were moments when I almost gave up because it felt impossible, because the cognitive dissonance of playing a role while knowing the truth was exhausting in ways I can't fully describe. He must have sensed something changing in me because he escalated, becoming more controlling and more unpredictable, accusing me of having an affair when I was 5 minutes late coming home from work, going through my phone and computer and demanding explanations for every contact and every search. And I had to be so careful, so methodical about covering my tracks because I knew if he discovered what I was planning before I was ready, he'd find a way to destroy me. One night he told me he'd been thinking about our future together and he wanted to have a baby. And the way he said it made it clear this wasn't a discussion but an announcement, another way to trap me, to make leaving even more complicated and painful, and I had to smile and nod and say I needed some time to think about it. While inside I was screaming because I knew I had to get out before he found a way to permanently anchor me to him. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer, using the secret bank account to pay for it, and the lawyer listened to everything I told her and looked at the documentation I'd collected and said I had a strong case for financial abuse and coercive control, that the evidence I'd gathered showed a clear pattern of manipulation and isolation, but she also warned me that he would fight back, that men like him don't let go easily, that I needed to be prepared for him to use the legal system as another, tool to control and punish me. She helped me understand that the moment I left, I needed to be ready for a long battle, that he would probably try to paint me as mentally unstable, that he'd use his money and connections and charm to make people believe his version of events, and I needed to be strong enough to stand firm in my truth even when everyone around me was being told I was delusional or vindictive or gold-digging. The lawyer also told me something that changed my entire strategy. She said that in cases like mine, the abuser's arrogance is often their downfall, that their need to control and manipulate extends beyond just the victim to everyone around them. And if I could get him to reveal his true nature in a public setting where there were witnesses and records, that would be more valuable than any journal entry or screenshot I could collect. That conversation planted a seed in my mind, a dangerous idea that grew into the plan that would ultimately set me free. The opportunity came when he decided to sue me for defamation after I'd left him and gone back to live with my parents. after I'd started telling a few trusted people the truth about what our relationship had really been like, after his carefully constructed image started showing some cracks because people who knew me couldn't reconcile the unstable woman he described with the person they'd known for years. He filed this lawsuit claiming I'd damaged his reputation by spreading malicious lies, that I was harassing him and his friends and colleagues with false accusations of abuse, that he'd tried to help me get mental health treatment but I'd refused, and he was seeking damages for the emotional distress and professional harm my slander had caused him. When I received the court papers, my first reaction was absolute terror because I thought this was it. This was how he was going to win, how he was going to use the legal system to silence me and validate his narrative that I was crazy and vindictive, and I spent an entire night convinced that I should just give up, just disappear, just accept that he'd successfully destroyed me and move on with whatever remained of my life. But then I called my lawyer, and she said something that changed everything. She said that by filing this lawsuit, he'd just given us exactly what we needed. He'd created a public forum where evidence would have to be presented and testimony would have to be given under oath, where his charm and manipulation would have to stand up against documented facts. And if we played this right, he would essentially be building his own cage. We spent the next 2 months preparing, going through every piece of evidence I'd collected, deposing witnesses who'd seen glimpses of his behavior, building a case that wasn't just defensive but offensive, that didn't just prove I hadn't defamed him, but proved that everything I'd said about him was true. And actually, I'd understated the severity of what he'd done to me. My lawyer found other women he'd dated before me who'd had similar experiences, but had been too afraid or ashamed to come forward, and they agreed to testify, to add their voices to mine, to create a pattern that would be impossible for anyone to deny or dismiss as the ravings of one unstable ex-girlfriend. The day of the hearing arrived, and that's where we started this story, with me standing in that courtroom watching him smile because he thought he'd already won, because he couldn't conceive of a universe where someone he'd so thoroughly dominated could possibly stand up to him effectively. The proceedings started, and his lawyer went first, presenting Marcus as this successful, generous man who'd tried to help his troubled girlfriend, who'd supported her financially and emotionally, despite her increasingly erratic behavior, who'd finally had to end the relationship for his own well-being, only to be repaid with public accusations and harassment designed to destroy everything he'd built. His lawyer presented evidence of my instability, screenshots of emotional texts I'd sent during moments when he'd pushed me to the breaking point, testimony from his friends about times I'd seemed upset or irrational at social gatherings where he'd spent the evenings subtly undermining me, financial records showing how much money he'd given me during our relationship, without mentioning that it was money I'd earned that he'd controlled. I sat there listening to my pain and trauma being weaponized against me, repackaged as proof of my mental instability, and I could see people in the courtroom starting to believe it, starting to look at me with pity or suspicion, and for a moment I felt that old fear creeping back in, that voice telling me I should have known better than to think I could win against someone like him. But then it was our turn, and my lawyer stood up and systematically dismantled every single piece of his narrative with the precision of a surgeon, presenting evidence I'd gathered showing the patterns of financial control, the isolation tactics, the gaslighting and manipulation, and most importantly, presenting recordings I'd made in the final weeks before I left, including one where he explicitly discussed his strategy for making people believe I was mentally unstable if I ever tried to leave him or expose him. The courtroom went silent when that recording played, when everyone heard him in his own words admitting to manufacturing evidence of my instability, discussing how he'd intentionally triggered emotional reactions in me so he could document them and use them later, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate someone once you'd convinced them they were broken and lucky to be loved. I watched his face as his own words filled the courtroom, watched his expression change from confident to confused to panicked, watched him realize that the weapon he'd tried to use to crush me publicly had just been turned against him in the most devastating way possible. The other women testified next, each one telling her own version of the same story, the same patterns of love bombing followed by control, followed by isolation, followed by systematic destruction, and with each testimony the narrative he'd tried to create crumbled a little more, until what remained was the undeniable truth of who he really was. Not a good man who'd tried to help troubled women, but a predator who specifically sought out vulnerable women and methodically destroyed them for his own entertainment and ego gratification. My lawyer presented expert testimony from a psychologist who specialized in coercive control, who explained to the court how abusers use legal systems as just another tool of abuse, how filing lawsuits like this one is a common tactic to silence victims and maintain control even after the relationship has ended, how Marcus's behavior fit every single pattern of someone who didn't actually care about defamation, but cared about punishing someone who'd escaped his control. The judge listened to everything, asked pointed questions that made it clear she understood exactly what was happening, and when it came time for her ruling, she didn't just dismiss his case. She made a statement about how abusers use litigation as a weapon and how her court would not be a tool for continuing patterns of abuse, and she ordered him to pay my legal fees and prohibited him from filing any further suits against me without explicit permission from the court. But the real victory, the moment that made everything worth it, came after the judge's ruling when reporters who'd been covering the case started asking him questions as he left the courthouse. When his carefully constructed public image collapsed under the weight of the truth that had just been publicly documented and validated, when the same charm and confidence he'd always relied on to manipulate people suddenly had no power because everyone knew what he really was. I stood on those courthouse steps, feeling the sun on my face and the weight lifting from my chest, and for the first time in 4 years, I felt like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs, like the world had suddenly gotten bigger and brighter and full of possibilities I'd forgotten existed. The months following that courtroom victory were their own kind of journey, because freedom after extended abuse doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels disorienting and scary, and sometimes I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder or waiting for the other shoe to drop, because I'd gotten so used to living in survival mode that I didn't know how to exist any other way. I had to relearn who I was without his voice in my head, telling me I was worthless, stupid, lucky to be tolerated, and some days that voice was still there even though he wasn't, because abuse creates echoes that reverberate long after the abuser is gone. I went to therapy, real therapy with someone who specialized in trauma recovery, and she helped me understand that what I'd survived was real and significant, that my reactions and struggles weren't weakness, but normal responses to abnormal circumstances, that healing wasn't linear, and I needed to be patient and compassionate with myself in ways I'd forgotten how to be. I reconnected with friends and family I'd pushed away, having difficult conversations where I had to acknowledge the pain I'd caused them by choosing him over them repeatedly, where I had to listen to their hurt and frustration, while also trying to explain that I hadn't chosen him so much as I'd been trapped by him, and most of them understood. Most of them welcomed me back with open arms and relief that I'd finally gotten out. I started rebuilding my career, dealing with the professional consequences of years of distracted underperformance, proving to my colleagues and supervisors that I was capable and focused and worthy of opportunities I'd let slip away while I was trapped in survival mode. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged. Some bridges had been burned too thoroughly to rebuild, and I had to grieve those losses while also accepting that they were part of the cost of my survival, that not everyone would understand what I'd been through or why I'd made the choices I'd made. I started dating again eventually, though it took me a long time to trust my own judgment after being so wrong about Marcus, to believe that someone could be genuinely kind without having ulterior motives, to understand that healthy relationships don't require you to constantly prove your worth or walk on eggshells or sacrifice your identity to maintain peace. I learned to recognize red flags I'd missed or ignored before, to listen to my instincts when something felt off, to understand that being alone was better than being with someone who made me feel small and worthless and trapped. I learned that love isn't supposed to hurt, isn't supposed to require you to give up everything that makes you yourself, isn't supposed to feel like a constant test you're always on the verge of failing. Most importantly, I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for, that surviving what I survived took more courage and resilience and intelligence than most people ever have to access, that using his own weapons against him and winning my freedom wasn't luck or accident, but the result of strategic thinking and careful planning and absolute determination to not let him win. I learned that my voice matters, that my truth deserves to be heard, that standing up against someone who seems more powerful than you is terrifying but possible, and that sometimes the only way out is straight through the fear and uncertainty and possibility of failure until you reach the other side. Looking back now, I can see how every terrible moment of those years with Marcus, every humiliation and manipulation and moment of despair, led me to become someone stronger and wiser and more compassionate than I would have been if I'd never gone through that experience. And I'm not grateful for what he did to me, but I'm grateful for who I became in the process of surviving it and escaping it. I want anyone reading this or listening to this to understand that if you're in a relationship that feels like what I've described, where you're constantly confused and walking on eggshells and questioning your own reality and isolated from everyone who cares about you. You're not crazy, and you're not weak, and you're not imagining it. What you're experiencing is real, it has a name, and you deserve better than that. I want you to know that leaving seems impossible until the moment you actually do it, that you're stronger than you think you are, that there are people and resources and organizations specifically designed to help you escape and rebuild, and that your abuser's power over you is real, but not infinite, not unbreakable, not permanent. If you can find the courage to start planning your way out. I want you to know that using their own tactics against them is not only possible, but sometimes necessary, that documenting everything and gathering evidence and building a case isn't paranoia, but strategic survival, that the legal system can be weaponized against you, but it can also be used to protect you if you have the right support and resources. I want you to know that freedom is worth fighting for even when the fight seems impossible, that your life on the other side of abuse is waiting for you, and it's so much better than you can imagine right now when you're still trapped in the darkness. And I want you to know that if I could do it, if I could turn his weapon against him and win my freedom and rebuild my life, then you can too. Because there's nothing special about me except that I got angry enough and desperate enough and determined enough to refuse to let him win. To refuse to be the broken shell of a person he wanted me to be. To refuse to accept that his version of my story was the only version that would ever be told. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for your own freedom or dignity? Have you ever felt trapped in a relationship or situation that seemed impossible to escape? I want to hear your stories in the comments below, because sharing these experiences is how we break the isolation and shame that abusers depend on to maintain their control. If this story resonated with you, if it touched your heart, or made you think differently about emotional abuse, or gave you hope that escape is possible, please leave a like on this video because it helps other people who need to hear this message find it. And the more people who understand what coercive control looks like, the harder it becomes for abusers to operate in the shadows. Subscribe to I Live to Tell for more stories like this one, stories of survival and courage and people who refuse to let their abusers have the final word. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because you never know when the story you need to hear will be the one that gives you the strength to save yourself or someone you love. Remember that you matter, your truth matters, your freedom matters, and you deserve a life where love feels safe and supportive instead of suffocating and scary. And if you're not there yet, if you're still trapped or just starting to realize you need to leave, please know that it's possible, it's worth it, and you're not alone. Thank you for listening to my story, for bearing witness to my pain and my victory, and for being part of a community that refuses to stay silent about abuse and refuses to let abusers win.